Hey, this is James with Synthtopia. I want to thank you all for joining us as part of Synthesia and thank Paolo for setting this thing up. We're going to talk today about creating an electronic music rig on a budget. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to show you kind of some gear that you can set up, how to make the connections, maybe talk about some choice gear, like really good gear that's like affordable but will also be useful as you get more gear. And then finally, kind of making all those connections to set it up. So creating an electronic music rig on a budget. So we want to find great gear to get started with. We want to find gear that's going to be useful as part of a compact rig. And then we want to also talk about how to get the best deals on these gear. So let's talk about the elements of a compact rig. And I've got an example here. And feel free to ask questions if you have any. We'll try to address those either as we go along or at the end if there's questions we can help you with. But this is an example of a compact rig, and I want to talk about what goes into choosing the elements of this, but then also how to connect this all together, and also what each role of each of these elements is. So in a typical compact rig, you're going to have a brain or a controller. Now there's lots of good choices here, but basically your brain or controller is what you're going to use to play your music from. So in the example I have set up here, we've got a Novation circuit. Now this is actually the older model. They just came out with a newer model, but this is what we have. The newer model basically is very similar to this, and it just adds additional features. Another good example I feel like is this here. This is a Arturia KeyStep Pro, and actually Arturia BeatStep Pro. There's also a thing called the KeyStep Pro, which basically is a keyboard version of this. But in essence, this is a sequencer, and you've got drum sequencing, and you've got 2 channels of melodic sequencing, and then you finally got a controller area, and you can switch between these. And the nice thing about this is that it's got all sorts of connectivity on the back. And so what you can do is you can connect in synthesizers using MIDI. You can connect in synthesizers and drum machines using CV and gate. It's just very flexible. So you can have create like beats on here. You can create sequences on here, and then also arrange them to create entire songs. The circuit's very similar in that respect, in that you can it's got 4 channels. Actually, it's got 4 channels of drums, 2 channels of synthesizers. Each of these synthesizer channels is really a completely independent synthesizer. I think they can do 5 voices each. So you've got 5 voices there, 5 voices on synth 2, and then you've got 4 channels of drum. It's got MIDI out, so if you want to, you can use this to control other devices. And the nice thing about this is that you can start off with just this, and something that you can use and just to get going with. But then as you add additional gear, you can send your audio out into a mixer. You can add MIDI. You basically take MIDI out of here and put that into other devices. And then you can even take MIDI devices and use that to play this. So you can play chords where that might be kind of hard to do on just this touch device. So some good examples of MIDI controllers to start with, I would say, would be like the Novation circuit, the BeatStep Pro, and the Arturia Microbrute. And again, this idea of the brain, this is what we perform from. One other example here is the Arturia Microbrute. The Arturia Microbrute's, I think it's like about $300, and it's a fairly basic synthesizer, but it sounds pretty good, and it's really flexible in that it outputs MIDI. It outputs CV and gate signals, and it's also patchable. So you can buy this, and then you can add on to it or use this for more and more things as your rig grows. So for example, you could use this right now as a synthesizer. But as you get more gear, you could say, okay, I want to take MIDI out of this, plug it into my circuit, and play chords on it. So then you're using it as a controller. You could take the idea of the analog CV and gate outputs and use that to expand into modular synthesis. So this is just a very flexible device. Those are all available for under $400, so they're that sort of price range and that sort of device is a good starting off place for building kind of the brain or performance center of your rig. Again, that you want to get something that you can just start with and play and have fun with, but then as you add more and more devices and more gear, you want to have something that will expand and let you grow into more complex setups. And when I talked about the Arturia BeatStep Pro, it's got the ability to connect to just about anything. So typically what people are going to do is they're going to connect this to some MIDI gear to start out with, or maybe a synthesizer, and sequence it. But as you get more gear, you've got all this connectivity on the back, which means that you could control a modular synthesizer. You could control a modular synthesizer and your synth software and your hardware synthesizer. So it's really flexible. Same thing with something like the circuit or with the microbrute. They each can be used on their own to do something that's kind of fun and to play with, and they can also be used to make, perform live or make songs with. But as he has more gear, you can do more with it. So with the Novation circuit, you've got 2 channels of MIDI sequencing, 2 channels of melodic sequencing that you could use to like hook synthesizers to, and that could be used to double the lines of what's in here, or you could just be using that to control another sequencer. So you're using that basically instead of the Eternals thing. So if I decide I don't like that synth engine because it's just not as flexible, or if I want to have hands-on control and live performance, I could take that MIDI that's coming out of this channel 1 and hook that into another synthesizer. So I could hook it into the microbrute. I could hook it into something like one of these Volcas that are really inexpensive but powerful and good sounding synthesizers. And then I've got hands-on control where it's kind of buried within the circuit. So you see, you start with a braid or controller. Next thing you want to consider is inexpensive sound modules. So you want to look for gear that's going to sound good now and will still be useful as you get more gear. I've already mentioned the Korg Volca series. I mentioned them before just because they're $160. They are compact, they're fun, they're kind of bite-sized in terms of the price range, but they also have good sound, and they support MIDI. They've got a lot of capabilities to that can be used for other things. So I know that it's hard to hear. I'm going to turn up my mic a little bit more. Let me know if that's causes a problem. So it looks like David had some feedback that he was having trouble hearing this. So I cranked this up a little bit. Let me know if that helps. So other items that you can look at, like Novation circuit I mentioned. Another couple of types of synthesizers that's really useful, I think, for kind of getting started with are things like the Korg Microkorg and the Novation Mini Nova. These are basically mini keyboards that are very inexpensive, and they have synthesis capabilities, they have sequencing capabilities, and they also have the ability to do vocoding. So they can kind of do all sorts of things. So let's take a look at the next thing you want to take a look at, and that's your mixer. You want to look for a mixer that has at least 4 mic pre-channels. There's lots of options available under for about $200, and then as your needs expand, you can kind of repurpose this as a live performance mixer or a sub-mixer. I've got an example here. This is just a inexpensive mixer. This one happens to be from Behringer, but there's like ones from Mackie, a lot of other different companies. What you want to look for here is these 4 mic pre's here. Basically, when you see these are full channels with full capability. So you've got lots of control over the inputs on the mixer. You've got a send, so you can control like you can control the send, so you can control effects per channel. You've got the ability to pan per channel and that sort of thing. And then you typically will have additional inputs set up as stereo pairs. So what I've got here is I've got this synthesizer, this microbrute. I've got that going into and I'll turn that a little bit so it won't blast you out. So I've got that going into a channel here, and we can basically control the levels here very easily. We can pan it, all that sort of stuff. So the key thing is 4 mic pre's because you're going to have 4 channels. I think smaller than that, and you're getting into a less expensive device, but then it's going to be very limiting for you. And when you start getting to like more mic pre's, what you're getting is you're just getting to a lot more expense. This to me is, I think, a nice size because it's a balance of useful now and also useful in the future without getting into a lot of expense. So next thing is effects. There's good starting point is just going to be internal effects on devices. So when I picked this out for just for showing a small rig, this one actually has effects on it. So I can go into the mixer area and add delay, or I can go in here and add reverb. The nice thing about that is that as your needs grow, as your capabilities expand, you could start basically dial those levels down of those effects in your device, add them in an external device. Now, something that's pretty popular with a lot of synthesis is this device. It's a Zoom 70 CDR. It's a multi-effects box, and what makes it great for synthesis is it's got stereo in and stereo out. So you can put this directly on a device like this. You could put this directly on your circuit and add reverb, just basically taking the output of this into this, and then taking the output of this and putting it into an amplifier or your monitors or into your mixer, any of those sort of setups. It's got, I think, close to 200 different effects options there now. So they range from chorus to reverb, delays, all sorts of things, panning, tremolo, and it's about $120, $130. Now, there's a lot of debate. You see a lot of debate over the CDR because it's not a high-end device. So like the reverbs on it are not as good as high-end studio reverb. But again, this costs $120, $130. Good reverb, just one reverb is going to cost $400, $500 more. And so the advantage of this is it's just like a great starter piece of gear. It's not going to be the best effect ever, but as your needs grow, as your requirements change, and you get more gear, you can repurpose this for, use it less or use it for other things. Now let's go back here. Again, as money allows, you invest in higher quality gear. The ones that are going to be the place where you're probably going to see your money going to in terms of effects is going to be first reverb. Reverb is expensive to do in hardware and to do it well. And then analog devices. So analog, I think the classic example is like Moog effects, Moog effects. Those are high-end, high-quality, really subtly built analog effects. And just because of the way they're manufactured, because they're limited, because they're hand-built, analog devices and hand-built devices are going to be more expensive. Again, you can start off with this. As your needs get more sophisticated, you get better effects. Now let's talk about making connections. So I've got an example rig here. And again, we've got a brain. And I could have used this as a brain, this micro brute, or the Novation circuit. It kind of depends on what sort of performer or music you want to make. The circuit is going to be designed more for people who want to do beat making or more sequencing oriented. Something like the micro boot might be more a good starting point for people who are more into performing, who want to play more hands-on performance. It also has a sequencer built in. So if you want to, more of a sequencing oriented, you can do that, but it's not a real deep, sophisticated sequencer in it. So either of these are sort of like good starting off points for that brain, or like I mentioned before, the BeatStep Pro. Then the second thing we talked about was adding additional sound modules. So I mentioned the Volca series. So the Volca series, they've got the ability to have MIDI in. So you see, let's see on this. Right there's going to be a MIDI in. They don't have like really sophisticated MIDI capabilities, but you've got MIDI in on just about all of them, I believe. And so really all it would take to start working with this and something like the Volca bass, new bass, would just be to take your MIDI adapter off of here and plug that straight into here. And then you'd have two sound sources to use from. As you expand and have more and more gear and better gear, you're going to sort of reach the limits of what you want with just sequencing and control and your sound module, and you're going to want to get into a mixer. And so, again, we talked about sort of like what I would consider the minimum starting point, and that's your mixer with 4 pre's. But let's talk a little bit about connecting this all. So what we've got here is kind of assuming that this is going to be the brain of the operation, and we've got the audio of this coming out into a channel on the mixer. So in this channel here we can control the volume, things like panning, and also send effects. And so we've got this connected into one of the stereo inputs because it's a stereo output device. This example over here is outputting a mono signal. This doesn't have any effects built into it. So we're taking the output of this into a mono channel. This gives us the maximum flexibility for how we deal with the signal coming in here. So we've got a pre up here. We can adjust the signal coming in to get like the loudest signal that we can without distorting. Then we've got our level here that lets us adjust it for the mix purposes of the mix. And then we've got a send here that's basically a potentiometer that controls how much signal is going into our send effect. So those are things that are like you're going to use the most on your channel. So each of these channels would allow me to hook up to one more device, but you've got 4 of these mono channels. So I could take 4 of the Volcas, or I could take microboot and a Volca, a collection of gear. And by having this on the mixer, having a combination of stereo inputs and mono inputs, I can use what's most appropriate for this device. So for example, if I were to plug this mono device into one of these stereo channels, one downside of that is that I've got less control. I don't have these potentiometers that let me control the gain on the input, and you basically fine-tune the input of that device. And the other aspect is that this is really you're wasting a channel there because you're only using half of the inputs on this. So having both of those and having them balanced among having a collection of ones with pre's and some stereo ones, it's just a nice setup. So you're typically going to see something like this in a starter rig. Then let's talk about a couple other aspects of how this is configured. So this mixer has what's called a send on it, and if you've been mixing for ages, this is going to kind of be redundant to you. But if you're fairly new to set up a rig like this, it may be new. And the idea behind a send is that you've got these red knobs. They might be a different color on your mixer, but basically these knobs are potentiometers, and they're adjusting the level of signal that gets sent to your effects unit. So the nice thing about that is that So the nice thing about that is that you can control that per channel. So what I mean by that is that you could have, let's say you've got 3 or 4 devices that are hooked up. You've got, like in our case, we've got the circuit hooked up, we've got the microboot hooked up. The send allows you to kind of fine-tune the amount of effect per channel. And what you're going to see on an inexpensive mixer like this is you're going to see 1 send. And so what's happening with the circuit and with the microboot is they've got a potentiometer for the sends. And as you play that, that's with the potentiometer turned all the way down, so no signal's coming out of here and coming into the zoom. as you turn this up, you kind of dial in how much reverb you want to have. Same thing here. So what that basically allows you to do is you can have a lot of reverb on one channel, you can have no reverb on the other, and you can basically create the depth of things that sound far away versus things that sound closer up. I got a note to pinch the volume on the microboot a little bit. Thanks for the feedback. Keep that coming. We'll try to keep things sounding good for you. So let's talk a minute about that. So basically, the idea of the sends and returns is that you're going to take the audio out. There's going to be a send on your mixer. You're going to send that into your effects unit, and that's going to come back as audio that you can put into your mixer. On higher end mixers, you're going to have more sends. You could have, for example, you could have a send for your reverb, a send for delay, and a send for chorus. And the nice thing about that then is that you could say, okay, on the circuit, we don't want to have any delay, but we might want to have a little bit of reverb. On the microbrute, maybe we want to have just a little bit of reverb or chorus or something to make it wider. So that's why as you get into more expensive mixers, they're going to have additional features like that. So the main things you're losing by having a more compact mixer is you're getting a single row of sends typically, and you're getting only a limited number of inputs. So let's talk next about making these connections. So as you see in here, you're going to even with a small rig, you're going to need some connectivity. Most people are going to start with headphones. You're going to probably advance from hooking straight into your rig, plugging in your headphones straight into your mixer, to taking your stereo outputs and plugging those into a audio interface to hook into your DAW, or hooking into amplification system for live performance, or plugging into a pair of monitors if you're working in your studio. Typically, that's sort of the growth as you get a larger and larger rig and actually have more gear available. So you can start with headphones, move into connecting your mixer to an amplifier, speakers, or monitors, and you're going to need some cables. Typically, with a small rig, you want to have about a dozen audio cables and patch cables as needed. So I've got several of these purple connections here. Something that people kind of wonder about is what sort of cables to get. There's all sorts of cables. You could spend tons of money on cables. We use these HOSA cables. They're pretty inexpensive. They've got lots of colors. There's lots and lots of good varieties. I wouldn't obsess over it. The reason I like the HOSA ones is just that they're fairly inexpensive. And they've got color coding. So within a setup like this, it's really easy to color code things in a way that are meaningful to you. If you may have seen behind me, let's see, on my modular synthesizer, I've got a hanging cable set that's got patch cords in different colors. The thing that's nice about that then is that you could say this voice is going to have yellow cables, this voice is going to have purple cables, this voice is going to have yellow cables. Or you can use colors to indicate gates and CVs and things like that. Just whatever makes sense for you. So let's talk about the last thing I kind of want to talk about is looking for deals. So the mistake that I think most people are making in creating an inexpensive rig is they're pissed off because they didn't get their TB303 for $99. So if you could go back in time and get your gear, you'd have the best setup ever, right? That's not going to happen though. So you shouldn't be looking for the gear that was a deal 10 years ago. You should be doing the things that the people who found the deals 10 years ago were doing. And what I mean by that is that people who are buying gear 10 years ago and they got these great deals on 303s and analog gear and all that stuff, they were buying the stuff that basically wasn't cool anymore. People didn't want it. At that point in time, people had moved on to let's take a great example is in the 80s. Nobody wanted things like Mini Moogs, and nobody wanted these old analog keyboards because they were all moving on to things like the DX7. digital keyboards, because all of a sudden digital keyboards had lots of polyphony, and so all this old gear started going really cheap. And so think about looking for the deals that are available now versus obsessing about the deals that you didn't get 10 years ago. So with that in mind, most used gear is available for about 70% of new. This is, of course, not going to be applicable to things like limited edition gear. The key example I think of is Moog puts out these limited edition Model Ds, or limited edition versions of different synthesizers they make. They make 1,000 or 2,000 of them, some small amount, or they make these re-release sort of synthesizers, and they're going to sell 100 of them. Well, those you're never going to get this sort of discount on by buying gear that's a year or two old. It's just not going to happen because it's limited and it's a collector's item essentially. The deals for gear that's available now is typically, like I said, going to be about 70% of the new price. I would, I show you this inexpensive gear. One caveat I guess I'd have about shopping for gear is that this inexpensive gear is a lot of it's not made to the same level of quality and robustness as more expensive gear. And so, I think you're probably better off on that sort of thing, just going ahead and getting it new. But then if you're looking at, high-end gear, more professional gear, like I said, you can get about 70% of what you would have of a new piece of gear. And then for other thing I think to consider is that, the deals now are the high-end gear from 10 to 20 years ago. And so thing to look for there is that professional gear from 10 to 20 years ago is not what people want to use right now because they're excited about getting the latest and greatest. And so a lot of that gear from 10 to 20 years ago that has lots of controls, lots of knobs, lots of capabilities is just not as sexy to people as whatever's brand new this year. And so if you look for that gear that's sort of in that 10 to 20 year price range, it's like 10 years ago or 20 years ago when all that analog gear was super cheap. You can get a lot of it very inexpensively. So one of the examples I think of things to look for in terms of gear that's like kind of at the sweet spot is things like high-end keyboards, like workstation keyboards. A lot of those, they're not the latest version. There's new devices that have more features, but like you can get a Kurzweil K2500, K2600, which are extremely deep, extremely capable pieces of gear for like $500, $600 fairly easily. Something else I think you should take a look for is unexpected deals or unexpected audio devices, test gear, tape recorders, organs, things like that. You've got, some of you may be familiar with this guy by the name of Heinbach. He's a German synthesist, and he basically, his whole aesthetic or his whole thing that he's interested in is taking cheap gear that is like weird test devices and old audio recorders that weren't even professional audio gear, and basically seeing what he can do with them. And because of what he's been doing and what people in that sort of that sort of aesthetic have been doing, that sort of gear now is becoming more and more expensive. But there's still lots of things that I think are really very useful and kind of interesting too. So like an example is home organs. Home organs, pianos, anything that was like kind of like an instrument that was designed or you kind of think of as like, oh, this is what grandma had. A lot of that stuff is very capable, but it's like worth almost nothing now because people associate that with what grandma did with it. But if you look back at like the way organs were used in the 60s and 70s, a lot of them were being used in very creative ways. So like krautrock and early cosmic music and early ambient music, a lot of it made use of organs run through effects. And again, you can get organs, basically people can't get rid of them unless it's a B3, in which case it's going to go for a lot of money. But like if you look at Hammonds that are not a B3, or if you look at basically any other brand of organs, you're going to be able to haul them off for nothing or maybe $100 and do some creative things with it. Another example is pianos. We actually got a grand piano for nothing. Grand pianos, any type of pianos, are essentially worthless on the used market unless they are a really high-end piano that's basically for somebody who's trying to train towards being a professional or an educator, that sort of thing. If it's not a super high-end piano, if it's not concert quality, if it's not something that's going to be for a professional pianist, if it's not at that level, they're essentially worthless. And so you'll find that pianos frequently are being find them on Craigslist because people just basically want to get rid of them because they're moving. You'll find them churches, they've gone electric and they're not using a piano anymore in their worship services. So it's very easy to find good deals on those too. Also, I think there's a lot of deals to be had on gear that's just weird. I mentioned Heinbach and what he does with test oscillators. There's people using dictaphones. There's people using low-end devices and doing creative things with this. And there's a lot of power and sounds in there that people don't know about. That people basically you have to find it. Another thing that's basically almost free to find is circuit bendable devices. So for example of that would be like you've got reams and reams of home keyboards, and these home keyboards you can find them on Craigslist for 25 bucks, 50 bucks, because there's just so many of them. But they can also be used creatively by running them through effects or circuit bending them, doing other things with them. So don't feel like you have to one, you miss out on all the cool bargains, or two, that you can't afford good gear, because there's still interesting gear available. There's weird stuff available that you can exploit and try new things with, and there's also great deals that you can find on the better gear and the more popular gear. So look for all of those things. So in summary, I just want to kind of reiterate this idea of kind of having a plan. And a good place I think to start with is this idea of having a brain, your performance controller, whatever you want to use for your particular type of music that you're doing, have something that's what you're going to have in front of you. I mentioned several different types of devices, circuit, the microbrute, the Arturia Beat Step, the Arturia Key Step Pro, I guess. All of those are devices that are kind of useful for being your performance center. That's a great place to start. And like with a lot of them, you can just plug in your headphones and you've got a place to play and to build from. Then as you start expanding, I think the next thing to look at is what are some sound modules. So with any device that you start with, it's going to have a palette of things it can do. So like with the circuit, it's basically got the ability to be a drum machine. It's got the ability to do channels of sequencing. So you've got that capability right there. But the synth engine is basically was a great synth engine, but don't have a lot of knobs. You don't have a lot of control of it without using a computer. So you want to expand into something where you got hands-on control. You can look at adding a module like the Volcas. You could add a module like another keyboard and basically connect those so you're sequencing from the circuit, still using that as your brain, but using that to control another device. Once you start getting into multiple devices, so really after you get to 2 devices, it sort of becomes impractical to just like add more devices and not have a mixer. So you have to jump into having a mixer at that point. Again, get one with 4 inputs, 4 mic pre-inputs, just because that gives you lots of flexibility. If you could afford a lot more of a mixer, that's great, because you'll spend it'll be a lot longer until you want to get a higher end mixer. But I wouldn't say get much smaller than this, just because you're going to outgrow it right away. Then I guess probably the 4th step in kind of building things out would be looking for external effects. Zoom CDR is a popular place to kind of popular all-in-one audio effect. You can route your sends into this and then route it back into your mixer. It's very easy to set up and configure, and you can dial in how much effect you get on each channel. So it's a nice stepping off point. Now, realistically, as you get more and more gear, you're definitely going to want to have more high-end reverb, and we're going to have more high-end delays and so forth. And as you add those, that's probably going to be the point where you're going to want to look also at another better mixer, just because that will then allow you to go into having multiple channels. This size of mixer, though, is at least going to give you a good place to start and also be useful, so that, for example, as you get out of, as you get a higher end mixer, you still might want to use a mixer like this one for live performance, just because it's compact, or like for a sub mixer on your rig. So you could have this be, if we're playing in a band, once we can play in bands again, you could have your rig all going through a mixer like this, take your audio out, send that off to a larger mixer. So there's lots of ways to reuse this, and this is like usually these are like around 150, 200 bucks. So it's not a huge investment for something that you may eventually grow out a little bit out of somewhat also. Like I said, there's lots of inexpensive used gear that sounds good. Don't look for cheap gear, I'd say. Inexpensive versus cheap gear. You want to have devices that are going to sound good now and still be useful as you get more gear. If you buy used, 70% of new is pretty good target. Popular places for buying used gear, the options that I think are probably the most popular are Reverb, Facebook groups, and Craigslist. The thing that's cool about Craigslist is it's local. You can try it out usually. Something that's really handy on Craigslist is to use a complex search. So what I mean by that is you can do a search for multiple things at once, and you can also do a search that filters out things. So for example, you could do search for keyboards or synthesizers or synth or Roland. And then you might say, I want to look for all of those, but not guitars or not drum machines or whatever you don't want to see. You could just say, I don't want to see that. Check on the Craigslist site, and if you look under the search information, it'll show you how to do a complex search. Basically, you create your search, you do organ, synthesizer, the things that you're interested in, minus the things that you're not interested in. And then when you view that page, save it. Save it to your desktop, save it to a bookmark. When you pull that page up, then it's automatically going to be filtered on the things that you're interested in. You can do the same thing with Reverb. Reverb lets you create searches. So you can say, I want to look for a core, let's say I want to look for a Moog Eurorack device that's under 500 bucks. So let's say you want to find a Mother 32 or a DFAM or Subharmonicon, but you don't want to spend $600 or $700 for it. Create a complex search like that. That also is useful for disciplining yourself, because one of the things that I found is that you get psyched up about a piece of gear and it's like, it's like $550 or 600 bucks. Let's get it. By having that search filter based off of what you want to spend, it's just basically you never see it, and so it kind of enforces that discipline on you. The other common place for people to buy used gear is Facebook. There's a lot of Facebook channels you can look at that are gear specific. So like Eurorack trades trade channels, or basically keyboard synthesizer trade channels. The thing to keep in mind there is that unlike Reverb, unlike other channels that you might explore, you're not going to be paying any tax on it, so it's going to be less expensive, but you are kind of taking the risk that the person at the other end is actually going to send it to you. At least with Reverb or eBay, you're going to know that you're going to get something or have some sort of recourse that should allow you to get your money back if you get a defective device or if you don't get your device. With Facebook groups, you're not going to have that sort of security. I've had really good luck with it, though the thing to look for a history for that particular user. I would really hesitate to buy anything from a Facebook user who doesn't have a history of other people giving feedback on that transaction. And that's something also, if you do try that approach, I would encourage you to actually leave feedback within that Facebook group so that others can see that they got a good transaction from that person. Final thing to remind you about is just being open to older professional gear and unusual sound devices. An example of that is chord organs, or these Steinbach-y sort of things. Any sort of audio recorder, anything like that, even if it's sort of lo-fi, is being repurposed for musical reasons. We've all heard CD quality sound and the pristine nature of that sound. And what we've realized is that those other devices that actually have coloration, that have noise, they have characters that are evocative. They're evocative because they make you think of the 80s or the 90s, or there's different distortions and there's different noises and different hisses and remnants and artifacts that are all characteristic of different time periods and different devices. So you'll think about, like for example, an example would be like lo-fi synthesizers, like chips in video games. Those like video game devices have become like hugely popular for making music because as time has gone on, those devices become like really evocative and really meaningful to people because those sounds remind them of their youth, they remind them of having fun, in their youth, and they have sort of a connection with that particular time period. And so look for those weird things that you might not expect as kind of options for expanding your rig too. So that, I think, I guess the last thing is just most of all have fun and make some cool music. I think that is the last of my prepared stuff. I'm just going to check and see if there are questions in the comments. So Amanda Hamilton asks about recommendations on gear that's inexpensive and doesn't take up a lot of space. I think that's a great question. I mentioned these new the Volcas. These are one of the most popular devices that people have come up with in the last. Any manufacturers come up with. I think that there's like 7, 8, or 9 of these now, different devices, because they're just like for 150, 160 bucks. They sound great, and you've got a complete synthesizer. Now, from my standpoint, I've got big fingers, and so these are a little fiddly for me, but they're not so fiddly that I can't do something useful with them. And they're also compact, which is fun because you can take them anywhere. And so, if I added this to this setup here, basically I need an audio cable into the mixer and maybe a couple MIDI connectors go from here into this rig. You can add a completely different sound to it because they have analog synthesizers, they've got digital synthesizers in the Volca format, they've got drum machines in this format, they've got analog kick or analog drum machine in this format. They've got a digital, like a DX7 type of synthesizer in this format. There's lots of other kind of compact systems. Something that a lot of people look at is basically taking the MIDI out of their brain. So I've got this, this MIDI out, I could connect into the back of this. And then they get an adapter and they hook it up to their iPad. Now on the iPads now, there's just dozens and dozens of different options for synthesis. And let me just see if I've got a good example. Well, there's GarageBand, there's all sorts of great, like Moogs. I think Moog's probably one of the best examples because they've got Animoog, they've got a bunch of different, they've got a modular synthesizer. And essentially what you're going to do is you're going to take the output of this into an interface to connect into your iPad, and then the audio out of your iPad, put that into your mixer. Other options that are really inexpensive that you might want to consider are, there's a whole line of Roland boutique synthesizers. They're a little bit more expensive than something like the Volcas, but they're also a little bit more capable. I think that the Volcas are a little bit more popular just because they're so inexpensive. They're kind of bite-sized in terms of you got 150 bucks left off at the end of the month, you can get one of these. Where with the boutique series, they're more in the range of like $300 to $450. So it's more of an investment, a little bit less of an impulse buy. But they tend to be a little bit more powerful also. So those are a couple of, I think, good kind of like key things that a lot of people are using. So let's see. Frank Goddard notes that there's pianos are really easy to come by. Exactly, that was exactly our experience. We found a grand piano at a church, they're getting rid of it because they do not use them in the. You can get a pretty good one, I'd say pretty good one for almost nothing, because there's an overhead with them. Basically you're going to have to assume you're going to spend about $200, $300 a year to keep it in pretty good tune for like home tuning. I'm not talking about like keeping it like recording quality level, but like just for having it be in tune, being enjoyable to play, and it to be useful as a musical instrument, and also to be useful for a lot of types of recording. You spending $200 or $300 a month or year is about what you can anticipate for pianos, and a lot of people don't do that. So they've got this piano that's basically out of tune, sounds like garbage, and they think it's terrible. It's just like it's taking up space. They move, they want to get rid of it, and if you don't take it away for $100, it's going to go in the dumpster. So there's lots of options for pianos. There's also tons of options for keyboard for organs. Now I mentioned like non B3 Hammonds. Everybody wants the Hammond B3 because that's the kind of classic jazz one. But there's lots of other Hammonds that are just not the B3, but are still very useful and very interesting and very musical. A lot of other B3s have been used in rock and a lot of different genres. Then beyond that, pretty much, unless you're getting like a rare 60s like organ that was used on some really popular song, if it's like a specific farfisas that were used on specific songs, if you're not getting that specific, one that everybody loves, they're worthless. But they're still actually musically useful because you think about something like the way The Who and Pete Townsend used organs. So like Pete Townsend's, like he made kind of a classic use of organ by taking the output of the organ and running it through his modular synthesizer. He put a filter effect on it. I think it's Don't Get Fooled Again. It starts out with that sort of vibrating chords progression. It's a little bit like minimalism or like Terry Riley. And basically what he did is he's taking an organ, running that through a modular, opening and closing the gate or the filter to get that sort of choppy effect, and then running it through some effects to make it kind of spatially interesting. And there's all sorts of things like that that you can try and explore for basically no money with an organ. So there's lots of options there too. We actually found a cool organ recently that's actually an ear organ. It's got a, and these like go for nothing also. It's an organ that's actually has a pump in it, and it's got reeds. So there's inside the organ, there's actually these reeds. So it's kind of like a pipe organ in the way it's built. Again, people don't want these things. They're junk, but they're musically interesting and can be musically useful. So yeah, look beyond the things that everybody wants, and you'll find some cool stuff. And really what makes a piece of gear valuable is the fact that people have done something interesting musically with it. So like I mentioned Heinbach, he was doing all this stuff with test gear and old tape recorders. And he's sort of like an example of that sort of movement. And because of that, because people are using those things for musical purposes now, the value of those have gone way up. So these things that he was getting for $50, 5 years ago, now they're worth $500. So that's a downside of it. Don't chase after what everybody else is doing is the bottom line there. So Christopher Grigg mentions there's the Kai drum machines. We're going for almost nothing at some point. There's a lot of these sort of stupid deals that you can find. You are going to find some deals that are just great deals, kind of has happy accidents. So be open to those. The thing that you're not going to find is you can't plan on getting the things that were happy, great deals 10 years ago. That's just gone. You might have one lucky find like that. So for example, a few years ago I was looking through Craigslist and found an Omnichord for like $35. Those go like $300 or $400 now because they've been used iconically on by a bunch of bands. Like for example, Daniel Lanois and Brian Eno used them like really interesting ways on some ambient music. And there's other performers that have used those more recently. So something like the Omnichord had become like really, really more valuable. Occasionally you'll find things like that because grandma, the grandkids, they don't know that was actually that is popular among musicians now. But you can't really plan on that. What you can plan on is that if you're looking at the gear that was like high-end gear 10 to 20 years ago, that's going to be going very, very inexpensively, and a lot of it's going to go back up in value as people start recognizing the usefulness of it again. Another comment on here. I'm late. Have you already explained particular ways to use a mixer in the setup, except for routing and adding effects? Well, you know, Jack, this is Jack Elster. If you've got specific questions on that, please pop that in there. You know, there's tons and tons of ways that people are using mixers. And you know, I kind of went into just to the basic things, and basically the main things I wanted to point out is like the limitations of a small rig mixer. And so, you know, we talked a little bit about the kind of the budget mixers and kind of what the minimum of a mixer that you'd want to get. You don't want to, you know, if you're starting out, you may not want to spend $500 or $600 or $1,000 on a big mixer that's got all the channels and all that. Maybe you'd want to, but you can't afford it. If you can't afford it, great. But you know, the reality is that a lot of people need a smaller mixer for affordability, and a lot of people need it for portability. And so, to me, the kind of balance between size and features is about. This is pretty typical of where I think the kind of the sweet spot is. And I said look for ones with 4 mic pre's on that, because basically what you've got then is you've got 4 channels that have the full capabilities that the mixer allows. And so you've got you know, the ability to EQ them, you've got the ability to do custom sound effects per channel, and you can pan them and so forth. And so that gives you the tools that you need to add the effects that you want, pan them, create a space, kind of create a layout of where the instruments are in kind of your stereo space, and also in stereo depth as you add effects. But you're also, you know, when you get a $150, $200 mixer, you're also buying some limitations. So you don't have 3 channels of send effects, for example, and that's really common on mixers. You also have like dedicated buttons to take things in and out of a mix very quickly. With a larger scale mixer, you'll have multiple sends instead of just one send. You'll have multiple dedicated returns. You may have built-in effects in your mixer. So there's just a lot of things that you don't get with a mixer of this size. And that's why I just say this is kind of a good sweet spot between expense and, if you go to the other end, you end up kind of being constrained. So like with this setup, we could easily add 4 more mono synths. We could add, a dedicated drum machine channel, put that on a stereo input. We could actually send out multiple outputs out of a drum machine into these inputs. There's a lot of things you could do. So if you had other specific questions about drum machines or mixers, let me know. David mentions Alm as a great iOS app for routing apps and MIDI controllers. That's a great suggestion. There's a ton of good apps available. I think one of the best, in my opinion, or actually any of the Moog apps are excellent. And the thing that's nice about the Moog apps is that they sound great. They've got expressive capabilities, because the Moog apps, they've got this sort of keyboard built into them that's designed for expressive performance. And this is a tangent. I don't really want to go into iOS apps super deep, but like they can do things. You can do things on iOS on an iPad using something like the model. I think it's Model 10. Because it's got a polyphonic expressive keyboard built into it. So that basically means that you can do things that you can't do on really just about any keyboard that you can get, because it allows you to control pitch and volume and timbre for each of those notes in your fingers interactively and independently. And to do that on most keyboards, like we look at something like this keyboard, this is pretty typical of what you can do on even $1,000 or $2,000 keyboards. You've got a mod wheel and a pitch wheel, and you can play louder or softer. and that's about the range of flexibility you have in most keyboards. That's starting to change because you've got this like MPE style of keyboards coming out. But as people are starting kind of to want to get more expressive with their performances, and the Animoog, and really I think all of the Moog synthesizer applications support that idea of an expressive keyboard controller where you can hit a note, slide it up and down to get vibrato, go up or down to change the timbre and so forth. And you can be doing that with multiple fingers. So if these fingers are lower and this finger's a little higher, maybe this is brighter or it's louder or has more vibrato. You can kind of control that by the way you patch it. There's lots and lots of other great iOS synthesizers, and I really didn't get into that today because really you can take your you could take this brain here and actually hook that into software also. And you could have that be your iOS pad if you want to stay away from your computer, or you could have that hooking into GarageBand, or you could have that hooking into Ableton Live, or to a dedicated synthesizer application. That's a whole new can of worms, and I kind of avoided that just because I wanted to focus on hardware, and people are really interested in hardware, and I wanted to kind of look at how you could like build a hardware setup for maybe under $1,000. This is probably 400 for this, 150 for this, 100 or so for that. Add another synthesizer or two. You could very easily have a compact rig for under $1,000, and that's just amazing to me because that really wasn't possible 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. Jason mentions Baba O'Reilly by The Who. Thank you. You've got a better memory and better on the off the cuff than I am. Jason asks, why not skip the mixer and go straight into a DAW and do the mixing there? That is a great question, and it just really depends on what you're trying to do. So, the rig that I've got set up is set up kind of just basically with the idea that you're going to start with one, add a little bit more, get into a mixer, and be able to do mixing right with hardware, and put in a pair of headphones. You can start with putting your headphones in here. As you add a mixer, you can plug your headphones in there, and you can play something. You can hook up some monitors. You can play live, and then if you want to, you can get an inexpensive audio interface, connect that to your mixer, and you're ready to record. Now the question is why not just skip the mixer entirely and go straight into a DAW and do your mixing there? That's actually a great option if that's what you want to do. And it's a great option if you get an audio interface that has enough connectivity to let you do that. And you're getting into like a higher level of complexity there though, because you're dealing with software, hardware. Some people want to get away from the computer. The other thing is that you're getting into kind of an issue with just routing your audio. So typically most people don't get a 32 channel or a 12 or 16 channel audio interface. Most people are getting like a 4-channel audio interface. And so what that means is that you're going to have to record things in chunks. And so what that might mean in a system like this is that you'd record audio from the circuit first, go back and add another track for the microboot, go back and add another track for the new bass. If you wanted to do it all live, you can do that, but you're going to need an audio interface that basically has the same amount of connectivity as your mixer. So when I talk about having 4 channels there plus your stereo channels, so this is 4 plus 8 here, so you got 12 inputs on a mixer like this. You probably want to have about the same level of inputs if you want to record a live setup and be able to do it all live. The other thing that some people do is they'll have a patch bay. So essentially, maybe you don't want to invest in an expensive audio interface that's got a bunch of channels. What you can do is you can take your patch bay, and patch bays are very cheap because they basically take a wire here and send it to here. You can take a patch bay and patch your patch bay into your audio interface, and then just by switching where that cable is going into your patch bay, you can say you want to record these 4 pieces of gear. So that 4-channel audio interface is enough maybe for a minimal rig, but as you get into a larger rig, you could use a patch bay to expand on that, or you can look at getting a larger audio interface. So that's again, if that's what you want to do and that's the approach you want to, if your goal is to record that, skipping the mixer and going into audio interface is definitely an option. So that's the other questions. Christopher Gregg says the Zoom line is great for capturing recordings. So basically, is a hardware interface for capturing, basically doing a DAW-less sort of like live recording. So that's the idea behind that is that on your mixer here, you can basically put a digital audio recorder off of that, and that way you're completely avoiding computers. You have a hardware thing, you press record on it, you do your magic with the music instruments, and then you turn off your audio recorder, and you've got a file on basically on a flash drive or a USB drive, something like that, you can copy over to your computer and do more things with. One other option, as Javier mentions, you can get mixers like this that have USB capabilities. And basically the idea behind that is that you put a USB cable on this and you plug it into your computer. The benefit of that is that you're skipping the fact that you might need to buy an additional piece of gear. You're just using your mixer and you're hooking it into your computer. But typically most inexpensive mixers are going to record stereo output. So they're recording the mix versus the individual channels. As you get into a higher end mixer, again, it's going to give you the capability to record each individual set of inputs, and you can record them wet, you can record them dry, you have the flexibility. So that's just something to keep in mind, that just because it has a USB interface that connects to your computer, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to record every individual channel and mix it on your computer. So if that's something you want, make sure that you understand what you're getting. The less expensive mixers are probably just going to have a stereo pair coming out. I think, let's see, Javier also mentioned the idea of mixers that have some like basically digital capability. So this particular mixer is from a few years ago. It doesn't have built-in effects, it doesn't have USB connectivity, and it doesn't have like the ability to record digitally onto like a flash drive or something like that. There are modern, more recent equivalents to this that basically have audio to digital converter in there. Once it's converted to digital, it can write that information into a flash drive or a USB drive you stick on the back, that sort of thing. Or they can connect with with a USB cable to your computer. So they have a lot more flexibility. So that's definitely available too. Again, make sure you understand what you get with that capability, because a lot of them are going to record a stereo mix. Those less expensive ones are primarily so that if you're like doing a live performance, you want to just capture a stereo mix of it, you can press record and you can record it right on your mixer. If you get a higher end one though, again, it's going to have the ability to record individual channels, which is what you want if you want to be able to mix it more later. So let's see if there are any more questions. I think those are the main questions. Thank you all for joining. I hope this was a useful session for you. There's a lot of stuff going on today as part of Synthesthesia, so make sure you check that all out. And thanks out to Paolo for putting this on, and thanks to you all for attending and listening to me talk for a while. Talk to you later and have fun making music.